Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and welcome to the Oraculos True Divination podcast, where I bring you ancient wisdom for the modern mystic. I'm your host, Mychal A. Bryan, and joining me today, all the way from Lisbon, Portugal, is Mr. Luís Ribeiro. Luís, thank you so much for being here.
It's a pleasure. Thank you for the invitation.
Most definitely. Now, for those of you who are new to the True Divination podcast, this is a platform where I bring you interviews from the astrologers who are shaping the landscape of the astrology that we practice. So if you haven't already liked and subscribed to the True Divination podcast, please take a moment right now, go down below, click the subscribe button, to make sure that you stay a part of the magic and the momentum that we're building here at the True Divination podcast. Now, Luís, today we have a really exciting body of things to talk about, and we started some of that conversation yesterday, and I can't wait to get into the belly of what it is we're going to be speaking about today. But before we go there, tell us a little bit about you, about your academic history, and also about your history in traditional astrology.
Okay, let's see, I'll start with the astrology. So I began studying astrology millions of years ago. But in terms of the tradition, I began around 2000, 2001, where Elena and I really began working with the tradition. We had some books already in Spanish on the translation of Abu Masar, Masala, that existed since the 50s and the 60s, which was quite nice.
Wow.
But we weren't still in tune with the tradition. And then we started to study it with Robert Zoller and then with Susan Ward in regards to orrery. So we began to incorporating more and more the tradition until we got to a point where we became traditional astrologers, full-fledged traditional astrologers. And that, I think, happened sometime around 2004, where we decided that this would be the way that we would follow in terms of practice, in terms of study. And that was the beginning of all our dynamics and studies. Meanwhile, both Elena and I started also our academic studies. Elena studied history, and she's now just finished her PhD at the Warburg Institute in History of Astrology, History of Science, History of Astrology. I'm currently finishing mine. I hope to have it done by the end of the year. It's also on History of Astrology, of course, what else? And we have been, we have been having these two different facets, one as astrology teachers and practitioners, and the other one as people who study and research the history of astrology. And we have projects in both sides of these areas. We have the school, the Academy of Astrology, and then we have also a number of projects that are being prepared. One of them is the Astra project, which is an academic project to gather a group of researchers to study the history of traditional practices in astrology. So what we're going to do, along with several projects and along the years, is to study not just the social and cultural content of astrology, which is always interesting, but the inner aspects of astrology. So how the techniques develop, how are the calculations made, how are the interpretations, methodologies changing to time. All of this from an academic perspective, and we got quite a group of scholars with us. So we hope that this project will gain momentum as we go forward. We were supposed to do a large conference on the topic this last May, but because of all this virus and the whole problems with the current situation, we had to postpone it, so it will happen next year. We will hopefully without with a more calm environment.
Right.
But yeah, that's our
Mhm.
current projects.
I think it's so important and it's so special what you're doing in terms of astrological research. And I always have dreamt about being a part of a group like monks who are studying in the heart of a monastery their craft. And I feel as if what you're doing is you're creating something very similar to that in terms of bringing together people with a singular passion and really poring over the methodology and the literature that underpins our astrology to create even better astrology, would you say?
Yes, I would say that. Yes. Um, we have, of course, the two versions, the academic and the practice, as I told you. Within the academic is to really know the history of astrology in depth, and not only by a few scattered sources that we have today. There's still quite a few, I would say, but
Hmm.
it needs a bit more study. And of course, that would improve practice, because if you're more aware of what they're doing
Hmm.
in practice, then you have more awareness of how to use certain techniques, and if they were used, if they were not used, if you're just talking just about something which is theoretical or specific to an author, or if you're talking something that was widely used by any practitioner. And one of the things that has been mine and Elena's, so I'm speaking a bit for
Hmm.
both, our passion is to really understand what exactly is an astrologer doing, because most of our tradition comes from primers, so manuals of instructions. And we know that what they say in manuals is not exactly what they do in practice. And you have a number of examples on this one. The most famous of one being Lilly, and everyone complains that he sets out a couple of rules and then does something slightly different or complete off. But that's normal. That's
Hmm.
that's current. So I think we truly learn when we see examples. So when we have, and of course, they're not the most common of manuscripts to find nowadays, but still there are a lot of research to be done in that regard. So I think the more we study exactly the techniques they're doing and they're applying and how they're applying, then you really know if something apparently nonsensical is widely used, and perhaps something that you thought, well, this must be standard, and nobody uses it. That's I think that's important, and that's quite interesting. And we've been finding out a lot of things. For example, Elena's thesis, which in the
Hmm.
future you can discuss with her in more
Yeah.
detail, is exactly a study, a detailed study on the notebooks of an astrologer from the 15th century. So just by seeing how they're calculating the almutants, how they're calculating longevity, how they're applying to the workout to orreries, to revolutions of the year, then you can understand exactly what's the focus, what are they paying attention, do they use strange things, where do they have doubts? That's an incredible thing. Sometimes they have doubts. They don't know if they should use the system A or system B. And that's interesting, because that's the same thing that we're going to have when we study the tradition and we find two conflicting sources or slightly different techniques. And you say, well, let's test it. And that's exactly what someone 500 years ago or more were
Yeah.
doing. Exactly
Yeah.
the same. They were testing. Let's see if this guy is right about this method
Hmm.
or if it's going completely off
Well,
the chart. Yeah.
well, just for our listeners to know, Mrs. Elena of Love is the wife of Luis, and we're going to have her on the podcast in the not too distant future so we can hear more about her work as well. But what I think is really interesting, and it's amazing how things tend to happen at the same time. I'm currently putting together a month-long Renaissance astrology intensive for July, in which we're going to essentially be doing this exact same thing in terms of taking Renaissance techniques and applying them and seeing what techniques actually work and what techniques are worth us still maintaining today. And the reason for this is because just as Elena is looking at these 15th century journals from past astrologers, I think that we as a community, we learn best when we have the ability to look over the shoulders of a seasoned practitioner as they're
Mhm.
practicing. Because, like you said, what we write down in our manuals and what we actually end up doing in reality, it's oftentimes two separate things. And so
Mhm.
it's really important that, yes, we do have the technical understanding of how astrology operates in a technical, pristine academic sense, but we also need to have an understanding of the journalistic astrology. What did these astrologers write in their journals
Okay.
based on what they actually practiced? So I think that's really amazing work that the two of you are putting together.
Thank you. We hope to produce more. For example, I can give you one of the most strange examples I could find today, which was I published an article, an academic article on that one, which is someone using telescope observations as an assistance for interpreting a chart. So this is someone, this is a late example, so this is 1656, if I'm not mistaken,
Hmm.
and he is judging an eclipse chart. So this is someone that's presenting a report to the prince, not the
Hmm.
king, but the prince. And he's also an astronomer, so quite common at that time, an astrologer, which also an astronomer, and quite a good one. And so what he does, which is absolutely incredible, and as far as I know, it's the only known manuscript which has this kind of notations. I haven't seen any records of such something similar. What he does is he makes observations of Venus and he noticed spots in Venus, which are probably cloud formations since the surface is not visible, and they have certain shapes. And so what he does is he incorporates those shapes, which are cross and certain elements which are of the heraldic shield of Portugal. So he incorporates those observations, that shift in the shape of the shadows in Venus, in order to also incorporate that into the eclipse and to extract further meaning. And that's absolutely incredible. I think this is the only known actual interpretation with a telescope until we find the outer planets, which
Uh-huh.
are incorporated much later, centuries later than this.
Hmm.
And that's absolutely fascinating. And this is perhaps the most exotic one I've found so far. And then you have a lot of them where they are calculating and they have doubts, and you can see them trying to reach an interpretation which they think it's more correct, and then having doubts, and that's absolutely fascinating. And we have learned over the years a lot from seeing these practice examples, which we don't have many. I think most, although we always have some examples in the old books, but sometimes they're a bit too synthetic, I think. And
Hmm.
I'm thinking of Valens, which is, I think, the earliest manuscript which has actual examples, and it helps. But they're still a bit strange, and there's always a problem with the ways he does things in practice and the way he explains them in the book. That's always a problem. And then we jump a lot of centuries to William Lilly, which I think it is the great example. William Lilly and more or less everyone writing in that period. You have also Gadbury and other sources which present proper examples, and they are not the main source we have of how to interpret certain things and how to see, oh, okay, this is what he does. This is how he approaches the chart, and that's valuable. And I would like to have examples from the Arabic authors. I know
Hmm.
there are, I think, hundreds or more manuscripts with charts and chart interpretations still in Arabic to be translated.
Hmm.
Latin, lots of Latin manuscripts with interpretations still to be translated, and a lot of them in the common languages of every country at the time, because people would be writing not just in Latin but in their own languages, and that's absolutely valuable, much more valuable sometimes than a new book on someone which is just writing more or less about the same things. practice. I think it's
Yes.
the biggest source. So we really see how things are moving through time, and I think that's our focus we should have in terms of research. Or else we'll be continuously debating if they would do it method A, B, C,
Mm.
C dot A, and stuff like that, because
Hmm.
that goes on forever, and sometimes it's not really productive.
Precisely. And Luis, I think it's really important the point that you're making, and it ties into the larger conversation that we're going to have today, because I think that it doesn't just serve research when we have examples. I think it also serves our overall approach to astrological education. Because
Mhm.
those of us who have taken up this mantle or this calling to teach astrology in the world, we oftentimes get caught up in making sure that our students are so theoretically, technically strong that we
Mhm.
oftentimes miss out on this very important piece of offering our students examples that are living, real, tangible expressions of astrology at work within the lives of people.
Mhm.
So, this piece of not only researching and finding these examples, but also teaching based on examples becomes the most critical piece in terms of our approach to astrological education, so that we create more astrologers who have an example based practice as
Mhm.
opposed to simply a theory based practice.
Yeah, I agree completely with you. I think theory is good. You need to have good people with good practice, and they need to know what they're doing. Really, I think a lot. I'm not going to give percentages
Right.
because then I might be unfair to a lot of people, but they're huge percent. But a lot of people don't really know what they're doing.
This is correct.
Um, Nowadays, what I see, it's a huge trend which people don't know how to calculate charts. People don't understand the mathematics behind the techniques, and I think that's paramount, because if
Mm,
you don't understand what you're looking at from a reality point of view, you
mm,
can't interpret it. And just talking about symbolism, it's not going to you cannot
mhm,
get away with it. You need to understand what are you interpreting, even if it's a symbol of something. You need to know. And nowadays there's a big trend, because we have a very easy way of calculating things. People don't know how to calculate charts. They've never done it. Um, and I always say to my students, you don't need to know it by heart. You just have to do it a couple of times and more or less have an idea how to do it. And then you go to the computer and you do it, of course. But at least you have an idea what's there. And then you go, if you need that at some point in your studies, you just go back to your notes and you read them again and you see how it's done. But you need that experience, or else it's completely devoid of reality. As
mhm.
sometimes I think in the most extreme case of this, you have people who start being astrologers, interpreting charts, saying the most rosy, wonderful things, and they don't know that the planets, and I'm not kidding about this, they don't know that the planets are visible in the sky. And that means, that happened to me a couple of times, that means there's a absolute cleavage between whatever they're doing and they're calling astrology and reality. And you can't do that. It doesn't work like that. There must be grounding. Or I know it's the sky, but you need to ground yourself somewhere. And this is, I think, it's the most extreme case of absurdity, but it does happen. And I think when we are teachers, we need to be aware of this. And so going back to the examples, because that's
Mm,
where we departed from this. For example, Elena and I have adopted a strategy of teaching with example charts, which is, even if we use charts of famous people, because sometimes you need the student to know exactly who he's talking about, we never say who we are studying. We don't say, oh, today we're going to study the chart of the king of something.
yeah.
Um, we don't do that. We just, there's a chart and we're going to study it. And you can study it from a general perspective, you can study it from a more specific perspective, but we're going to study and we're going to see what the chart is saying. And then, only then at the end, when the whole process is done, we reveal who the chart belongs to. because contrary-wise, you'll be making the students emit preconceptions, what they think they know about the person, and they're just going to try to fit the pieces there, even if they don't make sense. And then they'll start cherry picking planets and configurations to explain things that they think they know about that person. And sometimes it's an absolute surprise, because they have made a complete description of someone they don't know who it is, and they say, well, this is the chart of. And they, right. Oh, wow, yes, of course, it makes complete sense.
And Luís, I really wish that you and I had met ages ago, because I've been doing the exact same thing for years and years, and feeling like I was the only person out here, the one oddball doing that, because I think it is of vital importance that we be able to read charts without our preconceptions. Yeah. And I posted something like this in one of the Facebook astrology groups recently, and it was this entire thing that started because there are people who were saying, yes, that is actually true. And then there were people who were saying, no, you need to know everything about the person first and then go to the chart and make the chart fit the things that you know. But when we do that, when we start based on our preconceptions and then try to make the chart fit what we know, we don't actually do a service to astrology. And there are some people who think that it is probably even a sign of arrogance to think that we can assume to get information from the chart before first consulting with the person who the chart belongs to. But our entire basis of astrology is one that says that there is a body of information that stands within this chart, independent of me counseling or independent of me receiving information from the person who the chart belongs to. And yes, the chart could be the chart of an ant, it could be the chart of a dog, it can be the chart of a car, it can be the chart of a country, but the point is that it's a chart nonetheless, and if we go into it with the specific intention of interpreting it as a natal chart, there are things that that chart can tell us, copious amounts of information that that chart can give us without referencing the person who that chart belongs to.
Exactly, because in a consultation, you're not going to interview the person that's coming in order to know a lot of things about them, and then go
some people do. Some people do.
But then that's not astrology. That's I don't know, puzzle making or something like that. That's not astrology. I think the most clear consultations and advices I have given, it's when I don't know absolutely anything about someone, and you have a confidence in astrology, in what you have learned, just to sit there with the person and suddenly you say the main highlights of the person's personality, traits, tendencies, without knowing anything, and it's there. And then from there on, and then you can establish a dialogue and see what are the person's needs, what is the person looking for, and then the discussion normally. I was going to say profitable. Well, profitable in the terms of getting things out of it. That would be important for the person. Now, if you're doing guesswork, it's terrible. And I've seen that, for example, with predictive techniques. If you're going to go to famous people, and sometimes we need to go to famous, notable people so we can know what's happening in their lives, but I've always said this, and I say this in my classes, it's extremely difficult to find good examples, because either you're talking about something so important that is there, or else you might look at the charts, you're not seeing anything, because what you think it's important for the person, what is public for that person's life at that moment, it's not exactly the main thing happening in their lives. It could be something highly private that has never come to light, and you don't know about it because you don't have the feedback of the person. And you see that sometimes. You see people, for example, I was in my recent course that I gave online, that I'm now putting forward, one of the examples I give is Schwarzenegger, because he has a very interesting chart and he has a very interesting career. But at the same time, when you have highlights of areas of life, when you're having a lot of success and you're seeing that coming up in the 10th house and all the significance of fame coming in, you still have relationship dynamics which are quite complicated, money issues, and you see that that's not going to be a very rosy time for that person. And then you go and try to see if there's any more information on a biography or something, and then you find out that yes, he's on the verge of getting famous, but before he started to have a security coming in from that fame, he was having financial difficulties, he was sleeping in friend's house or stuff like that, and that's in the chart. If you're going to assume things, you're going to be wrong in all points. And I think, and now I'm going into a very complicated issue that I'll be bringing here. I think the problem is, and let me phrase this in a way that's not going to offend 90% of the astrological population.
Oh, Lord.
I think, oh, here it comes. I think people, well, the light version is they don't really trust astrology. They are astrologers, and sometimes they have been astrologers for decades, but they really don't trust astrology. If I'm going to go to the hardcore version of this, they really don't believe astrology. And I'm putting believe here in quotes because, yes, it's not to believe, etc., etc., etc. But they really don't think that that really can work, and that really works. There's always that inner dark element of doubt that taints everything that they do. And I think that happens to the best. And there's always a point where you're facing with, does this really work? Or am I saying this completely wrong? But there's a point in your practice, there's a point in your maturity as a student of astrology that you reach a level of security. And I think that's what lacks for a lot of people. And sometimes that happens, I think, to students mainly because they're going off on a tangent with every new technique and every new approach that's coming in. And I know that people have said this before, and they see that in this technique, the solution to everything that they cannot do in the chart with a simple basic delineation. And there they go chasing things, and it doesn't work like that. No, know the basics.
I can completely cry right now because I've been saying the exact same thing for years and years and years. And it's so uncanny how everything that you're saying parallels things that I hold to be very true within myself. And it's important for us to really come to terms with that piece that you just identified. The fact that oftentimes this unwillingness to say something specific, or this unwillingness to predict, or this unwillingness to step boldly into the unknown just based on the information that we receive from the chart, oftentimes comes from a very quote unquote logical or socially conditioned part of us that says that this thing isn't supposed to work technically. And what I found is I came into astrology as a child. I picked up my first astrology book when I was 12 years old, and I grew through my childhood and my adolescence with astrology as the basis of that. So I oftentimes take it for granted that other people who I talk to don't have that same sort of experience, because for me, it's always worked. I've never experienced life in a way where it hasn't worked. But when I have conversations with other people, there's this apprehension and there's this tension and there's this caution when it comes to really saying definitive things based on astrology because of whatever fears they might have about how it might sound or how it might come across and what if it's wrong. And the other piece that I think is really important is that, and this is something that I heard from Robert Coring before, who I hopefully one day will have on the show. He's a scholar of the work of Marinus. He says that the issue isn't that the chart has too little information. The issue is that the chart has too much information. And oftentimes people get caught up and they get confused. And sometimes the chart says something very specifically, but sometimes the chart tends to take you in multiple directions. And our issue that I think that we face in the 21st century with astrology is that there's so much talk in astrology about the astrologer needing to synthesize the person's chart and bring all the pieces of a person's chart together, when in fact that person probably hasn't even synthesized their own life. So, how can we assume to bring together these various pieces of a person's chart into one clean image of this person's life when, in fact, if you read the chart as it is, that person may resonate more with that disjuncted approach to the chart
Mhm.
than actually a clean version
Yeah.
of. You understand what I mean?
Yes, yes, yes. And things change. You have, I see things as you have a basic pattern, which is
Hmm.
the chart, and it's represented by the chart. A pattern that can express in multiple ways, and it's highly affected by environment, education, and all the conditions that you can imagine. Astrologers have been saying this since
Yes.
almost the beginning of astrology because they're not stupid, so they know exactly that even the characteristic can shift if you have a different environment, and that's basic human nature, basically 101. So quite simple concept, and it changes. So you have a pattern that has this potential and this way of manifesting, and then it can shift. The person can look at it. I always give the example of someone who is highly martial and highly impatient. You can be that, and for example, as a child, you probably were a terror because there's all that energy there, and it's coming raw, and perhaps you don't have an environment that can more or less adapt it to it. But then, if you grow up and you mature, then you can decide if you want to go for it, or if you want to set back and say, well, I'm going to set back on this one and I'm not going to pick up this fight. You can do that. It is possible. And that's where consciousness and change and self-awareness come into the equation. And they're there all the time. And these change, but the pattern is always the same. So
Hmm.
it's that you need to really understand to talk to the person. And the problem is you can go at the chart an infinite number of times and you're always getting new information from it. And the wondrous thing I think about tradition is that you have so many layers moving in, and you can. It's like you have a lens that you can focus and you can pull back, depending on what you want to do. And I'm always saying that to my students. As soon as I give them the basics, and then I'll set a few examples, and I say, okay, now let's complicate things a little bit further. What if you want to do a little bit more into this? And then you go to terms, and then you go to triplicities, and then you go to all those minute things that give you more specificity, the small details in the painting, not the overall picture, but the small details in the painting. And it's there, and you can always look at it from a different perspective. So you cannot synthesize that easily. It's not, you cannot put things into boxes that easily.
Right.
That's a problem with categories. There's a number of ways to do it, and you might not get the one that works better
Hmm.
all the time. Yeah.
So, Luis, in the education of a neophyte astrologer, what do you think is the system whereby we can provide students with things that they can work with and then eventually advance them into broader scopes of astrology?
Well, it's always a difficult thing, and this is one struggle that Elena and I have had for a number of years, which is pedagogy. How do you apply a pedagogical system to astrology? And we more or less have been working on our own for quite some time, and our book is one of the multiple expressions of that. And astrology has a problem. I think someone said it at one point, you should learn it all at the same time, because that would be the easiest way. But and that was quite a challenge when we wrote our book a number of decades ago, was how do we begin to explain astrology for someone who doesn't know a thing about astrology?
Hmm.
Complicated. And that was the last thing to be written of the book, the introduction, because it's complicated. How do you
Hmm.
start? How do you get going with things? The complicated things are easy, but it is the introduction. How do you present that for the present. What my opinion and our school's opinion in that regards, that there's always a basic set of rules. You have to have a basic set of rules, which I would call the delineation, the standard delineation technique, which you have to fall back to all the time. And you have elements. Always go for the elements as a descriptive tool. Elements, modes, ruling planet of a sign. That's always the basic description. If anything fails, go back to the element. That will give you a ground where you can then build up other interpretations. And then you have to understand rulership, the movement of the planets through the houses. And once you have that, that's your basis. And from then on, then you can start adding little things. If you go straight for terms, fixed stars, or antiquity, or something a bit more complicated, then you might do it right, but you're not looking the basis, the ground where that is standing, and they're going to fall apart. So I think everyone should know and should have in their minds almost automatically a system of delineation. Sign on the cusp of a house, planets that are there, ruler of the house, where is it in the chart, what's the conditions, and then you bring in the rest of the things, the dignities, and all the small conditions, from the most basic thing to the more obscure technique that you can find. Then you start to fiddle in. It's like drawing a painting. You just do the brush and you do the whole thing, and then you start filling up and composing with different layers of paint so you can get the detail you want. You don't start with detail, usually.
Yes.
You can do that if you're an expert and you know exactly what you're going at. And all the things that I've said, looking at charts of people you know, exactly who they are, you can do that, but you have to have that mental discipline that I'm going to look at the chart and I'm not going to put in a lot of things that I already know.
Right.
Or you can go in the chart and you can look for something that you want to see if the chart is expressing or not, because you know that person has that characteristic in the chart. But then you have to be extremely confident that you will look at what this chart is saying and not what you would like the chart to say. And that's not easy. That's not easy for anyone. And I see a lot of people coming in with predictions and stuff, and you can see that shifting from what they want to happen, especially worldwide. And then you look at the chart and say, I don't know.
Yeah. You know, something that I say to my students, and it's something that I think was first expressed by Margaret C. Hone, who was an early 20th century astrologer, is that there is a multiplicity of first things that a beginner has to know. So it isn't just one first thing that you have to know. It's all first things.
Yeah.
And so it doesn't really matter which of several first things you actually learn first. So what are you going to do first? Are you going to do the signs first? Are you going to do the elements first? Are you going to do chapter 2 of Ptolemy first and talk about the planets and how the planets receive their nature based on their relationship to the sun and the earth? Or are you going to start by talking about something more obscure, like the essential dignities? Like, what of several first things are you going to learn first? Because at the end of the day, when we're first starting out as neophyte astrologers, it doesn't matter which of several necessities we learn first, just that we have the foundation and the grounding and the framework. And I think that that's really the most important thing that we also realize as people who teach astrology, that we don't get overwhelmed by the fact that we have to usher in essentially a new generation of astrologers, because what matters is where we end up. It doesn't matter where we actually start. If you choose to start teaching the houses first, William Lilly suggests that astrologers start learning the houses first, because without having a firm knowledge of the houses, you're like an improvident man who has furniture but no place to put them. So the houses would come first in Lilly's system, whereas somebody else would teach the elements first. I personally believe in teaching the elements first, and then I take students through that whole first section of Ptolemy. But it doesn't matter because it's all first things. And what's
Mhm.
important is that when our students leave us, they have a firm understanding of first things.
Mhm. Yeah. Although I must say that the way you begin conditions the way you are structuring knowledge, and you have to pay attention to that. Although that it's true, you can start with the houses, but then you have to be really careful how you make the flow of teaching going in. We start by the elements, the basic foundations, the elements,
Yes.
and how is astrology, what's the language that astrology is using to interpret the world in the most basic sense. That's elements, qualities, elements, and all that. And then you go to the planets,
Yes. Oh,
because the planets are the main players. If you don't know who's playing, who's doing what, you can't work at it. And then you can go to signs. Usually you could go to houses. I would go to signs and then houses at the so, and then in that way you're structuring. You have a basic language, you have the planets, which are already incorporating that element from the basic language, and then that one is operating in a sign, in two referential systems, which is the signs and then the houses. And then
mhm.
perhaps you can shift those if you'd like to, but I do it, and I would go this way. I think that's the best way of introducing this in a way that helps the student then to start connecting things correctly.
Yes.
If you go to
Yes.
something like, I don't know, the fixed stars or essential dignities, that's going to be.
They have no place to put that information because you haven't
You
first.
you
Yeah.
need, yeah, you need other things to be known first. Then, and that's always a problem: is how do I go from A to B, and what's the correct order so that nothing fails? And what we usually do is, as soon as we taught something, we stop and say, oh, with only this information, what can you do?
Yes.
And sometimes we haven't the chart yet. The chart doesn't exist in the student's mind yet, and we're already okay. So what can we do with these basic elements? What kind of construction? What kind of interpretation of the world can we do by using these elements? And then we go forward. And then when you reach the chart, you already have a thing. And we always do this, which is scenes of the next chapter, of the next episode, which is you expand the interpretation a little more than the student can grasp at the point, so they can see this can go all the way there, at least. Now we got back here, and let's build this up again carefully, systematically, so you can know how to put things into place. And I think that's the best thing. And then there's those things that the students really hate, which is exceptions to the rule. When they figured out the whole rule, yes, that's how you interpret. But in this chart, you do have a preliminary opposed to something not in an angle. But that's the matter of context. That's advanced.
Luis, I
Yeah.
feel as if you and I are teaching from the same curriculum, and and we probably are insofar as we're both teaching traditional astrology, but I feel as if it is of paramount importance for students of astrology to have a working natural philosophy.
Mhm.
Because this is what every classical astrologer had before us. They all had an astrology rooted in the realities of the world. So when we start by teaching students this relationship between the agents and the patients of hot and cold, wet and dry, and how these four qualities come together through their co-mixing and they become the four elements, and how the four elements are the basis of how we understand the planets. If we go
Yeah.
back to Ptolemy,
Mhm.
lays out this method of understanding the nature of each of the planets based on their relationship to the luminaries and the earth. If we
Yeah.
begin a student's relationship to astrology in this manner, they end up realizing that astrology isn't just something on their mobile app.
Yeah.
And it's not just something on their software. Astrology is something that's based in the world. It's rooted
Mhm.
in the world, and through our understanding of astrology, it
And
takes us back to the world.
it's out there moving.
Hmm.
The machine is also I talked about. So the machine is all around us, moving around. So it's not just something that the printer put on paper. It's moving around. It's not just something in your screen. It's something that's at the same time it's moving around. We are fortunate to have a window here because we have students in the room.
Yeah.
So we have a window here that faces west, so we have always catch a bit of the sun, the sunsets and stuff. So because we give late evening classes, most of the time we say, okay, now we're stopping class. We're going to put out the lights and everyone's to the window, and we're going to look at something, and it's
Yeah.
there, it's moving. Just a couple of a week ago, something we have Mercury quite visible, which is rare. It's very difficult to see Mercury, and it was there, and it was fascinating. Even through Zoom, everyone went to their respective windows or ceilings or whatever they could, so they could see Mercury and Venus and have an experience. What they're seeing in the chart, it's out there, it's moving, it's real, it exists. It's not just something
Yes.
abstract, completely devoid of reality. Um, and that's what I think one of the big problems of too much automatization in
Mm.
everything. It's not just astrology. Is that at a certain point you disconnect that from
Hmm.
reality, something that really exists and it's out
Hmm.
there moving.
The very first assignment that I give my students, the very first thing that they do after I show them the basic layout of a chart and I say, hey, the top of the chart in the northern hemisphere is actually the south and not the north. And then
Mhm.
everybody has this confusion. Well, why should it be the south and why isn't it the north? I say, okay, tomorrow at exactly midday, go outside with your iPhone, hit your compass app, and turn your compass in the direction of the sun where it is at midday, and then come back to class and tell me where is that compass pointing. And they all come back the next day with their minds blown, and they're like, oh my god, it was pointing towards the south, I thought it would be the north. But I feel as if
Yeah.
it's so important that our students have a living sky astrology, an
Yeah.
astrology where the sky is alive, because
Mhm.
we have to realize that when we look at the chart, we're looking at the cosmos. And
Mhm.
the piece of paper in the front of us shouldn't detract from that, and it shouldn't separate us from this living reality that this is the
Mhm.
sky.
It's not
Oh,
just symbols in the paper. It's actual things moving around that
mm-hmm,
give that meaning. And that's yeah, that's something not everyone does,
mm-hmm,
and it's complicated. And nowadays it's so easy. Like
mm-hmm.
you said, you just grab your phone and you have a simple app and you just, oh, the moon is there. Let me see, check, calculate, and okay, it's in this house, it's there over there, the
Yeah.
sun's over there. Oh, it's a sixth house, and then you can start to grasp the distance
Mm-hmm.
of things.
Another thing that I think is really tying into this topic is the topic of combustion,
Mm,
because there's this thought in modern astrology, and I'm not even sure when it started, that combustion is something that is determined based on the sign that a thing is in. So if the
mm,
sun is at early degrees of one sign, and then another planet is in late degrees of another sign, and they're
mhm,
technically combust in terms of their degrees,
mhm,
there's this modern concept that no, they can't possibly be combust because they're in two separate signs. But
mhm.
the fact of the matter is that combustion is an astronomical experience. It's not
Yeah.
astrological. It doesn't care about the fact that the sun is in one sign and that the other planet is in another. Combustion is something that occurs within the sky,
Yeah.
because you can't see it. If it's within
Mhm,
that range of the sun, you can't see it. So it doesn't really matter what our astrology tells us. In a sense, it matters the fact that this is an actual living experience in the sky. And guess
mhm,
what? If Venus is within 7 degrees of the sun, you will definitely not be seeing that Venus because she is completely consumed in the rays of that sun.
mhm, mhm.
So it goes back to what we were talking about in terms of creating a natural philosophy that astrologers have, that they understand things based on an experience of the sky above their heads and not just based on the paper that we're teaching them from.
Yeah, yeah. I'm currently researching academically manuals of astrology, quite late, so early 17th century, which are quite interesting because you can see how they're teaching and presenting the matter. What is the sequence that they are presenting the matters? And I think all of those were astronomers. That is something that is showing up within a class, a large class on astronomy, of which astrology is just the practical aspects. And they all know how to calculate things. You get to the point where you need, for example, to calculate the houses. And they give you four methods, I think. Yes, four methods of calculating houses. One, use instruments, an astrolabe, or to a globe. If you don't have it, then you can use tables. If you don't have tables, you draw the chart yourself by creating your own astrolabe with the zodiac, by doing simple projection of the sky. And that's being taught to 12-year-old students, average. We're not talking about high university degree, right? But 12-year-olds or early, teaching, learning these things from mathematics and applied mechanics and astronomy. And you clearly see that whoever is, for the majority of part, whoever is working with astrology has a good degree of mathematics and astronomy, or else you cannot calculate a chart. I know there is always this idea that there might have been people in the past who were just interpreting and not calculating. There seems to be evidence of that. But even so, the astrologers, the ones that are writing books, the ones that are constructing the theoretical basis of, and maintaining the theoretical basis of the art, those are people who are knowledgeable in the whole science of the stars. It's not just astrology, it's the whole thing. Which includes, at that point, the mathematics and the astronomy. And there you have a whole, you have to do all of that before you can calculate the chart. So when you reach that, you already have a lot of information.
Right.
For example, sometimes nowadays, and going back to the combustion example, the Orientals and Occidentals and speeds and stuff like that, you do that after you have the chart calculated. If you did the calculations by hand, in which you have to adjust every chart, every position of every planet to get the chart, by the time you get to draw the chart, you already have the whole information, if it's Oriental, Occidental, if it's fast, retrograde, whatever. It's all there, and you already have built the structure of the chart. And somehow we have to do a similar thing. Of course, you don't need to go back to calculating charts by hand. That will take a lot of time, although a lot of people would profit about that. But you have to you have a certain methodology. And at there's some point when we reach the first year of classes in our academy, in which the students are confronted with the fact that before they can give any basic interpretation of a chart, they need to really look at it and get the dignities and the conditions and calculate the temperament and look at the mindset and mentality. And all of that has to be evaluated before you can really do a meaningful interpretation. You can only jump into the chart if you have a lot of experience.
Right.
And even so, it's dangerous because you might be rushing a thing and you might miss an important detail, especially in orrery, where the answer has to be very precise. And if you're rushing into it, if you haven't looked at the chart properly, you might get something wrong because you missed an aspect or you missed the reception. There's a little detail that you didn't look at. So there's time. You need to give it time to do it. For example, our examination system, I don't put the students in a class and give them, 2 hours to produce an interpretation. They have a chart, they go home, They study, they look at their notes, they look at other books that they want to, and because that's how you work in practice. You don't do, here's a chart, now do everything. You have to look at resources, go to your notes and work it out, especially if you're beginning. And so I'm not an apologist of emulating a mathematic exam where you're sitting there for 2.5 hours sweating and trying to see if you can remember all the damn equations and trying to have something significant coming out of that. You can't do that with astrology. You have to have the space for interpretation, to check the books. And if you have a doubt, I can't remember if the orb of the moon is 12 or 13 or whatever, go to the book and check it. It's okay. You don't have to know everything by heart.
Yeah, definitely. Luís, something that I think is really striking about 17th century textbooks on astrology and our modern approach to astrology is that in the 17th century, within the first 1 or 2 chapters, they've already taught you how to rectify a chart. Within the first 2 chapters, you already know that this is what you do to rectify the chart, and these are the procedures, and this is why you do it. Whereas today, in our astrological examination structure, rectifying a chart is seen as the highest level of astrology. When in fact, in the 17th century, chart rectification was the lowest level of astrology because that's where you started. You started needing to know how to rectify the thing. So it's very different. The fact that, like you said, yes, 12-year-olds were learning these things that today we don't even have access to, not even at our highest level of astrological thinking or people working in the trenches with astrology in this way.
Yeah, it's because you have a standard system of teaching. Even if there were some differences from school to school or teacher to teacher, that's always occurred. It happens all the time. You had a structure. More or less every manual of astrology, if we look at them from the Middle Ages until now, has more or less the same system. Basics, fundamentals. Ptolemy has this, and they more or less they go around, fiddle around Ptolemy's structure or similar structures, which is basic concepts. You have to get rid of that very quickly. That's usually a very small thing. Then you have structure with, depending on the time, either orrery or natal astrology, and then you go to predictions on natal astrology, and then you go to mundane, which is the really complex one, and somewhere in between these things you have elections. And that's it. And when you get to the natal chart, they first begin to rectify life, another one that's still more complicated today, life expectancy, and then you go to the chart. Nowadays, you won't do that. You're not going to give the person life expectancy because of, well, okay, hi, how are you? You're going to live until... No, you don't do that. It's not culturally acceptable at this point. Right. And nor people are able to digest at this point in time. So it's not useful for 99.999% of people coming into the consultation. But that's how I do, and it reflects their mindset. Of course, we don't necessarily follow that kind of structure, but we still need very basic things. And if you, as you are teaching, you're giving the students the idea that these things exist and these things are important, then you keep them present in their mind all the time. And then it's easier for people to understand that might be an important thing to address in the past. And with ratification comes 2 big problems, I think, in today's practice of even traditional astrology, which is conceptions chart, which was one of the bases for this kind of rectification, which I haven't experimented enough with those to understand if that works so well as they put forth theoretically. They didn't question that too much. They did a bit, but not too much. So they would follow that as a truth. And primary directions, which are the demon of predictions, Because there are very few programs that put the damn things correctly. And they were quite simple in the past. Well, they always have, because they're being used by people who already know the astronomy of them.
Right.
Nowadays, we don't have it. Most people don't, so they don't know what they're doing. And what I've seen so far is that you have programs that are an absolute disaster in the way they output the directions. Some of them are getting better, I must say. I was a bit surprised. But still, there's a problem with the significator and the promiser, and that's a mess. And you try to explain things to the student, and the programs are doing the opposite expression, and it's a mess. It's a mess because everyone's following what Placidus decided to revise, and from there on, it's complete chaos.
Well, my friend Anthony Lewis, he showed me once a way of doing primary directions easily and clearly using solar fire. So when we're done with this interview, I'm going to reach out to Tony and see if he can remind me how to do it, and I'll let you know, because it was some mathematics. You had to subtract something from something and multiply something else. And so I'll tell you.
I once, the first time I got a simple and easy formula for primary directions, because I was having doubts translating the medieval aspect of how they explained it to the present, and I didn't have the tables at the time. Oblique ascension tables, it's something that you don't have. You have to calculate them by hand. And I was fortunate enough to meet with James Holland, late James Holland, at a conference, and an academic conference at the time. It was 2004. And he sat down and just wrote a couple of formulas and said, see, you can do this. And then if you transform this and this, that's it. That's it. Now I can get the formulas correct. And you have software that does it. My problem is that there has been too much theoretic discussion on how to calculate them, and then very little in how to interpret them. For example, one thing that has been appalling up until recently is if you read any book on primary directions, especially medieval, early modern, until 15th, 16th century, you still find it, the basis of interpretation of primary directions are the terms. Everything is around the term. It is the term ruler that defines the event, the timing, the mood, whatever you want to call it. Then you go to aspects that eventually the significator can or cannot do while transversing that part of the zodiac. And that's very basic. But now, what happened a couple of years ago is people just split directions into two different things, which is direction by terms and directions with aspects. Never. When you get to Placidus, which is 1650s,
much later.
By then, Placidus didn't really believe that terms function. They have been completely eradicated from the astrological system because they were not rational, along with a lot of things. So you cannot really follow them in terms of interpretation if you want to go to a more substantial interpretation. So if you're using terms and if you think terms are quite useful, well, terms are the basis of directions since the Hellenistic period. They're one of the main focus of practice. But even so, you don't see a lot of people doing them. Even people who are revising Hellenistic don't really go into that too much, or as much as they should. But that's because the concept has been distorted. And that's a problem with historical things. You're just picking up from a point and then going forward, but you forget, well, but this has a tradition that goes much farther than you're expecting, and it's much more rich than you would. And that, I think, comes from a large defect that we have, and it's no one's blame really, is that most of our teaching in tradition, until very recently, begins with the early modern period, what we also sometimes called Renaissance period. For me, as an historian, Renaissance more or less goes up to the 15th century, and not much than that. So, for example, for me, calling Renaissance, this is an historian thing. Calling the William Renaissance doesn't fit into
Yeah, yeah,
my mental system, but it's okay. That's just nomenclature. So
yeah.
the early modern period, 15, 6, but basically 16th and 17th century, you have to be. There's a lot of precious information there because they're really thinking out the techniques, they're refining techniques, and they have absolutely wonderful techniques.
Mhm.
But most of them are revisionists. They're trying to recreate a supposedly pristine Greek science of astrology that never existed, and they're carving out bluntly enormous pieces of the system out because they cannot be explained. So their criteria is completely different. So they are extremely dangerous in
Mhm.
a certain aspects. They're still good sources. Moranus is one of them.
Yes.
Moranus has very interesting discussions about techniques, but he's one of the fiercest revisionists of astrology. He is not a
Yes.
traditional source. Lilly, which is much later than him, it's much more traditional in a sense than Moranus is. That
Much
doesn't
more.
mean, yeah, doesn't mean it's not a valid source. But if you want to get in touch with a more approachable way for interpretation, Lilly is better in that regard. Lilly and some of his contemporaries are a bit better. Um, late 16, early 15, that's, you have to know what you're looking for, or else you're going to see them changing the term system, the dignity system, and coming up with things or extracting things out which are not supposedly to be practiced, or they cannot practice because they have the Inquisition at their feet. Complicated, very complicated period. Very few studies on it, really, that really tell us what they're doing. But still, it's a danger. And most of our learning comes from that period initially.
Hmm.
So what happens is that creates a preconcept on a series of techniques that then we carry along. And we're all guilty of this in some way or the other.
Right.
That doesn't mean that these preconcepts cannot be good in the sense of practice, because they weren't exactly stupid, so they knew, and they were practicing astrology. They're not just theorizing about it, so
Right.
they know what they're doing. It's to a certain point.
In terms of the terms, and I'm going to touch on the Marinus point as well, but unless we fiercely decide to pick up aspects of our tradition and utilize them, they will be lost.
Mhm.
So within my own nativity, I have 24 Sagittarius rising, which, depending on which term system you use, that's going to come in the terms of Saturn. And my chart ruler, which is Jupiter, is at 4 Virgo. And at 4 Virgo, that's within the terms of Mercury. And my entire life is Saturn Mercury. Like every single thing about me is
Yeah.
Saturn Mercury, regardless of all the other chart factors. My chart can be summed up in two words, and that's Saturn Mercury. And
Mhm.
I found that to be the case also in applying that to chart consultations that I've done for clients. That when you take a look at that ascendant term as well
Mhm.
as the term of the chart ruler, it gives you that much more information in terms of nuancing your understanding of the character of the native.
Mhm.
So
Yeah.
we also have to realize that they do have something to give us in terms of actual interpretational value
Mhm.
regarding the life of that person. Now,
Exactly.
now the Marinus point is I'm of I've always been of two minds about him. One, I'm so amazed and in awe of the fact that you got to sit down next to James Herschel Holden because he is my personal hero and I
Mhm.
probably have everything that he's ever touched, well, all of his books that is, in
Mhm.
my home. And one of the major things from him was his interpretation of Marinus. And
Mhm.
I love the way how Marinus thinks about astrology, especially book 21 on chart delineation. It's
Mhm.
a fabulous, fabulous book, and he lays out a fabulous, fabulous system. However, his triplicity rulers, his essential dignities, his throwing away the terms, throwing away the faces, throwing away so much of classical astrology. It it's too extreme in my opinion.
Yes.
And he ended up throwing away the baby with the bathwater. And granted, the way how he approaches delineating charts
Mhm.
is meticulous. But the fact that he's thrown away so much of our traditional understanding of what the different essential dignities means, I think is really detrimental.
Mhm. Yeah, and I think it's a mentality problem. And if we want to really understand them, we need to understand the mind frame of that time. In that period, what you're observing is a rationalization of the world. Things are getting more rational, more scientific, if you want to call it that, at least in the modern sense. So there's this need to revise and turn it more scientifically. And we have to think that all of these writers, and it's just not Morinos, it's all the other bunch of them, what they do is they are turning astrology, in their views, into something more operative, more scientific, more functional. That's their prime objective. It's not to just throw out the things out of pure spite. That's their goal. And so anything they think that they cannot explain by their standard of how astrology should work, they're going to remove it. And the terms are one of the first to go. Because their idea is still that astrology must be explained by a natural, the action of a cause, a natural cause. So terms cannot be easily explained by natural causes, along with, I would say, almost 70% of techniques. So those are thrown out completely. And that's quite complicated. And I really would like to understand one day, and I hope to do that, what is going on in their minds, because clearly they know that these things work because they have experience working with them, but at the same time they're uncomfortable by the fact that they cannot explain them properly. And by that time, Ptolemy is no longer an authority, because they have seen a lot of things Ptolemy said are not exactly true. So he's no longer a reliable source. The world has changed, and nothing is as the old authors would do it. So it is a frame of mind, an interesting frame of mind to understand. They're trying, even Placidus, which is a completely mathematical obsessed entity, is a mathematician. And what he's trying to do is to give you a mathematical reasoning for the whole thing. He throws away perfections, which were one of the mainstream tools for prediction, because he thinks they're not rational, and then he puts in what we call today secondary progressions into the point, which very simplistic way, he puts it in a very simplistic way, and then comes Alan Leo centuries later and complicates it all, because this is a personal opinion. He didn't really want to bother with calculation, and he had to sell his produce, so he had to find out simple things because people are not going into maths. But let's not go into that. They have all sorts of reasons to do things, some not very good ones, but this is a mathematical. But going back again, it's a mathematical thing. So they're trying to improve. The problem is they're so self-righteous in their way that they're going to improve the world, that they're destroying the thing that they're going to improve. And I think one of the many reasons why astrology simply collapsed at the end of the 17th century, starting mid-17th century, is because at this time, everyone was questioning every single aspect of the techniques. And at some point, it doesn't work anymore. You take out the terms and you shift some kind of the triplicities, and at one point, it no longer works, because it has no longer a relationship with what it was before, and it starts collapsing. That's one of the reasons, because then this mixes up with a lot of other things. It's a very complicated process, the fall of astrology, downfall of astrology. But this is one of the reasons. It's practitioners really are a bit confusing in the way that they're approaching it, and there's a lot of theoretical discussions, and a lot more theoretical discussions than actual practice. So things get complicated. So the voice of theoretical reasoning, completely obliterates practical experience, and things go down the drain. And this is always a dangerous point to and going back to the combustion example that we're giving. And I think that degree thing, other side thing, I think it's traditional. It's I don't. My problem is I've read so many things. I don't recall exactly who said it, but there's some. I don't know if it's Lily or someone around that time that says that combustion is not as afflictive if there's a shift in sign, which doesn't mean that it's not a combustion.
Right.
It means that there's a shift in quality there that might bring something other. But still, that's the problem. It's then you get to theoretical. Is it a combustion? It's not a combustion. No, interpret the damn thing.
Precisely.
Look at the chart, do it, and it has a meaning. And you follow the rules. You don't even need a special, very special, specific rule for that. You just go by the overall rule for that. And people sometimes get distracted with this minutia.
It's true. And I also think that specific to the combustion point, we have this long-standing concept in astrology that if you can justify something 3 ways, then it stands, basically. Or if you can find at least 3 testimonies for a thing, then that thing holds true. And if you look at the planet, how it's operating within the chart, and if it does fall in this category of, okay, sun is 2 degrees of the next sign, and then the planet that's applying to the sun is probably 1 degree away from that next sign, and you're trying to scratch your head about whether or not that's a combustion or not, you look and you see other things within the chart. Is that the only thing that debilitates that planet? Or are there other testimonies within that chart that corroborate this fact that you think that that planet is debilitated by its proximity to the sun? Because if the chart says multiple variations of the same thing, then it kind of gives us an ability to gauge whether or not this planet, say Mercury, for example, or Venus, for example, is actually combust by our definition of combustion based on its proximity to the sun. But it goes back to actual practice. And that's the major piece that I think I want for people to get from this today, that we've been talking about this entire time, is that there is so much currently being done in terms of reviving aspects of ancient astrology, and it's really wonderful and really amazing work.
Yes.
But when we go online and we look in the forums where people ask their astrological questions, and then there are 20 responses, each a paragraph long, and not one of those responses has the actual answer to the question, then for me that's problematic, because what we've become is essentially the Sanhedrin Council of astrology, but we don't actually do things that feel like practical astrology. So what I wanted to ask you, Luís, is where do you think astrology stands now? Because I know that you're a part of a lot of the same groups. And well, let me not even reference that, because the two of us might get kicked out. So let's just...
There was.
We might get kicked out of the group, so let me... let me go back. Okay. So Luís, what I wanted to ask you is, today where we have so much revival work being done and so many people around the world having access to all of these new techniques of traditional astrology from our past, where do you think we actually are in terms of creating a cohesive, unified approach to our traditional method? Or do you think that with all of this information that we're receiving, it's only causing us to become more theoretical in terms of our approach and less practical?
Well, I think now we are in a very messy point, because people are getting, and I'm talking about students, people who already have some basis, they always have their flotation devices that can go back in the middle of all of this. But I think students are getting drawn in all these theories and all these possibilities and all these hypotheses that should be debated in a much higher level than that of practice. And people are confusing history of astrology with practice of astrology. The fact that techniques existed in some obscure manuscript at a certain point in time, in any timeline you want, it doesn't need to be exactly in a more ancient perspective, doesn't mean exactly that it was sanctioned. Or it was actual practice. Sometimes they're just referencing it because they're encyclopedical in a way. They reference it. They just say, well, there's this guy that says this, and there's this guy that says that, and there's this guy that says that. That doesn't mean they endorse it. Because sometimes you go to the end and say, well, I do it like this. Mm-hmm. This is the way I do it. That's the most clear that you can get. And you cannot... There are several problems with this, and let me try to more or less put them into into items that we can discuss. And one of the problems is that it's from theory to practice, there goes a very quick jump. Things have just been published months ago, and suddenly people are doing workshops and classes on that. Come on, you can't. I find some techniques that I find interesting. I found them valid. There might be something interesting in it. I'm not going to do a workshop about them, showing my vast experience on the subject just after 2 months that I read the books. It doesn't work like that. That's one problem. There's a jump into a theory. You can experiment. You should experiment. But one thing is an experience. The other thing is actual teaching something that you really haven't had the time to practice. That's one problem. People jump because it's a novelty thing. That's a problem. That's what completely messed modern astrology. Was a novelty, a new asteroid, a new falling star, a new space station in the sky, whatever, and everything has to have a meaning. And then they lost it, and in certain ways, literally. And they always invent things which are wonderful and new instead of practicing correctly what they have. So traditional practitioners are guilty of the same mistake. Mm-hmm. It's very nice to know to know new things. It's wonderful. I'm always looking for them myself, but then there's practice. You need to have maturity to see if it works, because sometimes they go off in a tangent with weird theories about techniques that, if you look at the practice, no one used. Elena once came across a reference in Ibn Ezra, and Ibn Ezra is highly critical. He's extremely acidic to other practitioners, which is wonderful to read. Ibn Ezra says something, I think it's relative to longevity, that there is this guy, which we don't know who it is because it's one of those obscure authors that only he mentions, that had this theory which he calls the heavens. And then he adds, but it's something like, and I'm completely paraphrasing, but this is utter nonsense, and the whole theory should be thrown into a oven because it's worthless and a complete absurd. So if someone found that theory in a manuscript, perhaps it survived a copy of that man's work, that doesn't mean it was accepted as something functional. Perhaps sometimes even they didn't use it. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And you see that, for example, with house systems, the taboo thing. I'm not going into that too much. I don't want. For example, it is believed, this is always updating itself as research comes in, it is believed that what we call today the Campano system was originally created by Al-Biruni, so much earlier than Campanos. And I think Campanos didn't wrote anything about the house system itself. I don't recall why it's named after it, but there's some mess there. But he's the only source that we know of that clearly states in one of these almanacs that he is the creator, the proponent of that system. But the researchers that were looking into this notice that when he calculates his own chart, he doesn't use the Campanos house system. He uses the Alcibiades house system, which was the standard system for centuries. So then you look at it and you see, well, he has a theory,
Yeah.
but he's not practicing it necessarily.
Mm.
And this is just a small example of one of these discrepancies between theory and practice that we have to be aware of. And that's why I said, the fact that it's in a book doesn't mean that they would do it. And especially medieval, that's not so much a problem with the Renaissance and early modern period, because then they're more didactical in the way they present things. But in the medieval period, and I'm sure antiquity also has this, they express, books are rare, they are unique, so they will put in everything, piece of scholarship that they can find on the subject. But that doesn't mean they're actually using it in practice.
Mm-hmm.
That also doesn't mean that obscure constructive techniques don't work, because you do have techniques that you would say, no, this can't, they wouldn't apply this. And then they did. And they work well. And I think, not now because tradition is already well known, but the terms were one of the things that everyone said, nah, it can't work. It's an absolute absurdity. And they work wonderfully. Mm. How did they come up with that complicated system? We don't know. It's ancient. We know that it's Babylonian in origin. It's quite more ancient than we thought of, but it works. Someone sometime practiced that, found that, created, I don't know, but it works. It works wonderfully, and you can test it. So I don't throw things out in the trash just like that, even for more obscure and strange that it is. I do give them a chance, but I think most of the strange things that pop up here and there are not really usable. And historically, and I'm now going to shift to my historical perspective of things, the things that really work and that you can be secure about are the things that survive continuously throughout the whole practice of astrology. Those things you can really rely on. Mm. Then there are variations throughout time which you have to address more critically, you have to experiment, and you have to see if it works. Mm-hmm. My theory is, if it didn't survive, there's quite a good possibility that it was not something that was highly practiced. Okay. So, and this is point one, I think, about. There we go off in a tangent, long footnote there. But that's one point, theory and practice.
Yeah.
The other point is not having a structure to fall into. Okay, mm-hmm. And that ties into what we were saying. That's why I got back. Mm-hmm. You need to have or your flotation device so you can be secure while you're swimming, because you get drawn in the ocean of information quite easily. And the internet is very good to extract information, and it's absolutely wonderful for research, and it is a nightmare in terms of opinions and personal agendas and whatever. Yeah. So you need to swift that very, very carefully. Mm-hmm. Because anyone gives opinions, and we never know if that person really has a solid, grounded opinion, or if it's just showing off the fact that he read this translation, what knows.
Luís, what I really value in what you said was this point of needing to have maturity in order to approach astrological scholarship. And what we find today is that everyone can read, and it's as if anyone who can read and who can pick up a book considers themselves to be an astrological scholar. Yeah. And this is largely the dilemma of modern traditional astrology, because everyone has so much more access to all of the techniques of the entire world. So sometimes you see there's a post being made about something in Western astrology, and then another astrologer comes in and says, well, in India, this is what they say. And it just becomes this really diffuse approach to astrology because of all of the knowledge that beginners have. Not
Yeah.
necessarily because of all of the knowledge that seasoned practitioners have, but because of all of the knowledge that beginners have, and they end up doing
Hmm.
more harm than good with all of this
Yeah.
knowledge because they don't know how to apply the skills, they don't know how to integrate the skills within the body of their current knowledge, and they also don't know how to get overwhelmed or swept away with the new thing that they read. And
Yeah.
that ability to have a firm sense of where you are and a firm sense of what you do, even as you interact with other techniques, that only comes through years of experience.
Exactly. Time. You need time to develop a critical opinion on something. You cannot
Yes.
do it just by reading a book. You can have an opinion, but that doesn't mean the opinion has validity. You need to ground it.
Yeah.
And there is something in Portuguese, I don't know if it works on other language, called it. Things right like now are what we call a Russian salad. A Russian salad is something that we just throw every piece of vegetable that you can think of it, and you just throw in a bucket of mayonnaise in it, and it can be anything. And
Yeah.
it's tasty because it has the mayonnaise, but it has no absolute nutritional value whatsoever or sophistication as a cooking thing. So this is what I call it's a Russian salad. You know, you throw everything in, and it starts to get messy.
Yes.
Vedic tradition, Indian tradition, highly consistent throughout centuries. It has a system on its own, and people are just going there to justify things which are Western in practice, and it's getting a mess.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Not only in terms of mixing systems that don't actually work together because you have referential systems which are sidereal and non-sidereal.
Mm-hmm.
So it's getting that completely unnerves me is also that you're not respecting one, you're not respecting the traditions, you're making a mixture and you're going to overwhelm a practitioner with suddenly, because people are talking about, oh, but how does the term work? How do you select them? Which is a practitioner's
Mm-hmm.
question, very valid question at some point. And then someone puts in the nut chakras and something else that they come up with because it's sophisticated and you do that. Yeah, but that has validity in its own system. Don't start mixing things or else you're going to get a mess.
Mm-hmm.
It's like Play-Doh. If you start mixing all the colors, you get a big blob of nothing with a very ugly color, and that's not
Yeah.
astrology. It's a mess, and that's a natural danger. It's having a critical filter. That doesn't mean you cannot study every tradition that you like and you desire, and if you want to have scholarship or a knowledge, good knowledge of every tradition, that's okay, but you need to put everything in its own compartment before you're starting to mix everything in one go. It doesn't work like that. You're not respecting the systems and the
Mm-hmm.
traditions. That's highly unrespectful of the tradition itself.
Yeah.
And people think that, oh, I can do anything I want. Yeah, you can, but then it's not astrology. It's a mess
Mm-hmm.
and doesn't do practical results. And I think that's the problem with learning on forums and learning on you can get very good, extremely nice pieces of information when you have people who know are knowledgeable of the subject and going at it, or you can have a big mess in which they're not answering anyone's question, they're just making it messier and
Mm-hmm.
confusion, and people come out of there with,
With
I
nothing.
don't know, nothing, feeling ignorant, and it's not that they're blamed. They're just at the beginning, so they need to understand things.
Mm-hmm.
It's complicated. I don't know, and I think this originated right from the beginning, where at the beginning when the tradition emerged, you had three grand schools or lines of approach. You have the Hellenistic, and you have the medieval, and you have the Renaissance, the slash early modern thing, and they were all fighting amongst themselves because everyone had to be right instead of looking at it. You have it's astrology, it's all astrology, it's a tradition. Everyone's quoting everyone. Uh, so why are they're fighting? You just need to. I think that's a bit arrogance of people who are leading these projects most of the time. Not all of them, but there was a lot of arrogance. Some of them were quite good students of the subject, but they were also extremely arrogant in their opinions. And you have to see, you don't have to believe or to stick to one system. You need to understand what's the backbone.
Mm-hmm.
What is the backbone of the system?
Luis, I think it's really important this point that you're making because you're right. We can play with something so much until it turns into this glorious shade of mud. And when it
Yeah.
turns into mud, it doesn't have any of the colors that initially
Yeah.
went into creating it. And you're very right when you say that we don't respect the traditions that we're pulling from when we choose to create this hodgepodge of everything. And once again, I think that it goes back to us as the people who are out here teaching astrologers to really ensure that what we give to our students is a firm awareness of their own lineage and a firm awareness of what is stated within our own tradition so that they can freely interact with other traditions without becoming converts to those traditions, and not necessarily saying that they won't one day convert, and that's probably not the best word, but not
Yeah.
saying that they won't one day adapt and adopt methods from other traditions. But initially, students should know where it is they come
Mhm.
from, what is said about this technique where I come from, and how can I apply it to the purpose of practical astrology.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. And if you're going to go multiple traditions, which you can, and I know people that did,
Hmm.
but usually people who are successful in their use of different tradition, it's because they would see things from one tradition and then, okay, this is what this is telling me. Now I'm going to see the exact same thing with the other tradition. And then I compare results. I'm not comparing the inner workings of things,
Yeah.
unless I'm going to study it academically and theoretically. I'm just using two different methods for reaching the same thing, which are completely different. And here, for example, I think the best example is Indian astrology or Vedic
Hmm.
astrology. I don't know what's Jyotish, what name do people prefer. So I'm saying everything I know. So if there's a proper name, please do say
Right.
it. But that tradition, that Indian tradition, and then the Western tradition, at the lack of a better name, which is also very diverse, but Western
Hmm.
tradition. And you can use both, but the referential is different. So you need to be careful, and you can use it, look at the chart, and you have a completely different approach. It's a whole different mindset system. And if you're starting to mix things together, you're going to get, it's like trying to run a Mac program on Windows or vice versa. It's not going to work. It doesn't speak the same language. And it's going to be a mess. So you have to respect the tradition. And syncretism of traditions can only be done if you are a truly expert in several things. And
Hmm.
true experts in things are rare, and it's not just by reading 2 or 3 books in 1 or 2 years, or sometimes less, that you're going to be able to do any kind of syncretism. You can have a good idea, but that doesn't mean the good idea works.
Right.
People sometimes have good ideas and they have these pet theories. Everyone has a pet theory at some point. You're allowed to, but you have to see if it really works. And it's not going to be in 2 years, 2 months, 5 minutes that it's going to work.
Right.
And people have to be aware of that. So yes, I think people have to be aware of their own traditions or the tradition that they're studying.
Yes.
There are a lot of Occidental people from an Occidental line that are studying Vedic and they're loving it and they're quite good at it. It's okay. It's vice versa. So that's not a problem. That's not the problem. We're in a global world where everyone has access to everyone's tradition. So that's okay. But still, you have to be respectful of the tradition that you're
Yes.
studying. And this is not going to be like that.
Yeah.
And that's the problem with today. I think we have a strong view of the theories of astrology. And there's a lot of historical interest in astrology. I love history of astrology. It's a thing I want to research, so nothing against it. But people sometimes don't see the differences between history of astrology, practice of astrology. Two
Yes.
different things.
Yeah.
They can inform each other. There can be lovely exchanges between the two, but two different things. They have to be careful, or else we're going to create a chaos. That's what I've seen so far, a chaos in the discussion of traditional that's very similar to the state that astrology was in after the 80s, where you had one very dangerous affirmation is it's the anything goes thing.
Yes.
It's the slippery slope of anything goes. So it's very dangerous path to tread. It's not for beginners.
Right.
It doesn't mean that there's no validity in certain affirmations of symbolism, but then you're going out of astrology. It's something else.
Mm-hmm.
And that's no longer astrology. And that's practice of astrology.
Mm-hmm. At the end of the day, I think it boils back down to this concept that you have to know the rules before you can break them. But it isn't just a matter of knowing the rules. We have to actually have mastery of some aspect of our field before we can begin meddling with the field, or even thinking that, hey, let me go and invent something. Like, before invention comes, you have to be an adept at whatever the field of study is that you're studying, and astrology is no different. So the license to invent on behalf of a lot of astrologers these days, it seems completely unearned, because the people who are inventing aren't necessarily the people who are in the trenches, who are out there working day in and day out in astrology, on astrology, whether it's through client work, whether it's through horary, whether it's through electional, whether it's through mundane. The people who feel the most entitled to invent within our field aren't necessarily the people who are out in the trenches working in the field. And so I think that, once again, going back to us as astrological educators, we have to not only teach our students the rules and the practice, but we also have to teach them how to have a spirit of discernment within themselves that allows them to be able to take part in wider astrological conversations and not be overwhelmed by all of these new and untested and uncharted territories of astrology. And an example of this that comes to mind, because it was recently in discussion, is when they discovered this planetoid Eris, automatically astrologers were giving definitions about what Eris meant. And it was ridiculous. Like, how could you give definitions for what Eris means, and it was just discovered yesterday? But once again, this ties into this concept that people are assuming themselves authorities on things that we have no real authority over. The ancients assumed themselves as students of astrology even after thousands of years of scholarship. So who are we to today to automatically assume ourselves authorities of something just because we happen to know the mythology behind this Greek goddess Eris, you see?
Yes, and you can have an opinion or an idea or proposition, but it's still that. It needs to be verified. And you have to have the humility of understanding, okay, this is my view, or this is how I understand it, or I practice and it seems to work, but it's still an opinion. It might not be canon. And you have to be aware of that. And the same thing goes, now that you touched that, and I'm going to touch another of the sensitive points, which is the outer planets, the modern planets. That's another trend that I'm seeing today, which is a sort of bias against traditionalists that do not use the outer planets. Yeah, that's always been here since the beginning. But now I'm seeing, and the main thing that the traditionalists say at one point is that we have a very rich system that isn't basically used. This 80s, 90s, especially 90s is the focus of this discussion. And we're using things that we haven't had time to experiment really. And we are ignoring a lot of things that have millennia of use and practice throughout time. So we have to rethink this. And the idea, I think, in most traditionalists, and this varies very much from personal opinion, was that let's forget the outer planets right now, because everything is outer planets. It was starting to get completely lunatic. And let us forget that. Let's reconstruct, relearn the core, perhaps not reconstruct, but relearn the core of our art, of our knowledge, and then we'll have to reassess them again in a new view and a new light, and go back at it again. That hasn't been done. And what's happening nowadays is traditionalists are again assimilating the outer planets into their traditional practice, which is then no longer purely traditional, but they're not doing any analysis work on if their meanings are correct or not. They're just taking for granted what everyone else has said since the beginning of the 20th century and putting it back again in the bucket. So there were no critical analysis of this. And this is extremely dangerous. So this is a regression in my perspective. It's not incrementing. Practice is just going back to the same problem that we had 2 decades ago.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not evolving. There's no critical discussion on the outer planets nowadays. For example, Pluto. So it's a problematic one, so let's pick on him. Pluto. For a long time, historically thinking, in the beginning, there were suspicions about several authors that Pluto could rule Aries, because then you would have, in their logic, if we're going to follow that logic, that's the logic, doesn't mean it's correct, but that's the logic, Uranus to Aquarius, Neptune to Pisces, then Pluto to Aries, and you would follow a different scheme. Somehow, the geometry would be set in. It's quite logical. Why didn't we use it? Because most of the schools that addressed this subject disappeared. There's a lot of experimentation, for example, in Europe, with Pluto. And I remember when I started to learn astrology in the 90s, there were still schools around that had different attributions of dignity to Pluto and rulership and everything, because everything was still in discussion, and Aries was one of them. There were Sagittarius, there were Gemini, there was a lot of discussion on it. Nothing was settled. But because we have a cultural, how shall I say, invasion, which is natural because of history, of the English-speaking community, let's say it like this, they have the majority of views, and we're talking in English. So, and we're communicating in English, and I'm writing in English, so that's okay. I'm not going against it. I'm just saying it is. So the English views have more power than the others. But if you go to Germany, if you go to France in the mid-20th centuries, they have completely different views on how these things work, but didn't survive because their voice was not loud enough. Yeah. For example, Pluto is also the god of the green. It's the telluric strength in mythology that makes things grow, makes things spring out of the earth. So it has a connotation of fertility, which would go quite well with Aries, which is the beginning of spring.
Right.
It's as logic as anything else that you can find in the other justifications for the planet. Doesn't mean any of them is correct.
Yes.
And people are not thinking critically. They're assuming that there are decades of experience. Decades of experience are not good. And there is also an extremely dangerous problem with astrology. Astrology is an interpretive art. And in any interpretative art, you can get carried away. Mm-hmm. And at one point, you're not interpreting the chart. You're just making a grandiose speech on the symbolism of a planet. And when I started studying astrology, I've seen this all the time. People would not interpret, and they still do it nowadays. They don't interpret the planets. They just give a speech on what the planet means. Mm. And then, but it's in the sign of whatever. And then they do a grandiose speech of what the sign is. And then the house. And then something else. And it's always theoretical. It doesn't mean, okay, but what the hell does that mean in that specific conditioning, in that specific structure? Mm. And what I've seen today, and it's always a danger, it's one of those phantoms, that haunts any person working with interpretative things. You get too carried away, and then you start believing your own imagination instead of doing a good interpretation. And between symbolic inspiration and your imagination running wild, there's a very thin line that sometimes we go off of it and go off in a tangent. And people have to be aware of that. And at some point, we all get carried away in an interpretation, but there must be something that we can go back to and say, wait a minute, I'm getting carried away. Let's look at this again by the book. And that's large ledger. You cannot pontificate things, and I
Right.
see people doing that all the time. And it's something that is very common in modern practice. It's one of the reasons why I completely got out of there. This is much better. You're not pontificating. And it's going back again. And I'm seeing traditional people supposedly studying tradition doing the same thing.
Yeah.
And they haven't learned a thing. So we're going back again to the same thing. History repeating itself.
Well, I definitely think that when it comes to any hermeneutic study that's fundamentally based on interpretation, whether it's interpretation of things that you have learned through your studies, or whether it's interpretation based on your own independent research that you've put together through your practice, there's always this fine line between how much fidelity should I show to tradition when they may not have known as much as we know now, and how much daring should I show in the direction of creating, or rather adding to the body of what the tradition has said before me. Because astrology is fundamentally hermeneutics insofar as we are these interpreters of humanity. We're interpreters of human life and of this geocosmic relationship. So I think that all of us kind of stand in a precarious role of, yes, adhering with great loyalty to what has been done before, but we also, it is inherent within our humanity to want to broaden the scope of our perspective based on the fact that we now live in the 21st century. And I think that there's something beautiful about it, but I do think that it becomes potentially unsettled or ungrounded when we don't refer back to the tradition. So I think that it's always a matter of stepping forward and checking the tradition, and then stepping a little bit further forward and checking the tradition until we end up with something that's not necessarily classical astrology or modern astrology, but a neoclassical approach that takes into consideration where we are in the 21st century while still holding space for what our forebears have given us for thousands of years.
Yeah, we are astrologers of our own time. None of us is medieval, Hellenistic, or whatever astrologer. We are astrologers of the 21st century, whether we want it or not. And our interpretation of the symbols, our interpretation of the meanings exist in this reality. So there is an adaptation that must be done. And of course, everyone that has ever written about astrology and did some kind of reflection on astrology has done his own interpretation of the system. The thing is, am I doing an interpretation which is based, as you were saying, on the grounds of what's already been told? So it's like when you're doing an academic essay, you might have an idea or a point of view that you want to explore, but you will always have to explore it within what's already known and what's already said. So you're quoting things to support that you reaching a different conclusion or a slightly different approach, but it has to be grounded.
Yeah.
And I don't have any problem to translating and modernizing astrology in the sense that we don't have, for example, if you have a Mars Mercury aspect, strong aspect in the chart in terms of configuration of your vocation, you're not going to be a cobbler. You can be a software engineer or something like that, but you have to adapt. It's the same idea, but adapted to a completely different reality and social structure. But you cannot make up things that are not there. I recall many years ago in a lecture I did on vocation, someone coming up to me, this gentleman coming up to me at the end and saying, well, I liked a lot what you said, but I was a nuclear engineer, something to work with nuclear energy. And I said, and I always attribute it to the fact that I have Uranus in my midheaven in Scorpio, I think. Yeah, I don't know. I don't recall. He had Uranus in midheaven. That's the point. And I said, yeah, but where do you have Mars, for example? And then he had a prominent Mars also in the 10th house. And I said, well, in the tradition, the fact that you're an engineer who works with radioactive substances and dangerous things that can blow up at any time, Mars itself, it's enough to do that. You don't need Uranus to be radioactive. Mars is radioactivity in essence. Anything that gives out heat or radiation. So you don't really need it. You don't need an upgrade. It's not giving you that kind of upgrade. It can add something. Well, it might, but we need to see it from just clean it, get to the drawing board from the beginning. What can that mean? Go to the planets and try to understand what exactly are they talking about when they're activated, or can they be activated? But my problem is not that this discussion can be done and can be done properly. Is that, and perhaps we can find out some of the meaning that already attributed to it really are valid, but you need to do the study, and no one has done the study, not properly. Everyone just picks up those symbols, writes a book, and puts it out without critical thinking of whatsoever. And sincerely, I'm not, and a lot of people might get offended with what I'm going to say, but I do not trust most modern astrologers to do a proper analysis. They're too contaminated by their own way of thinking to really do a proper analysis on the subject. You need to be able to rethink your own beliefs in order to do that. Like when you shift to tradition, if you shift from modern to tradition, nowadays people are getting into tradition directly. But when I shifted from modern to tradition, I had to completely readjust systems in what astrology was and how it worked. And that was tough, because the first thing that you learn and that enchants you, you tend to stick with it. It's nice and beautiful, but that doesn't mean that it's not exactly that. It's one step ahead. And that's a process, and you need to do it. And the same thing with the outer planets and a lot of things. And I think people are not paying attention anymore. I think people want to be happy with each other, and they're doing a lot of concessions. I'm not going against anyone using whatever they want. It's their problem. The consequences are for them, but no, more or less. But you shouldn't. How can I say this? You cannot believe everything that people say. People are too tainted with their own views of the world. They are too enchanted with their mythological things, and they might be completely off in a tangent, and I don't trust that. And I think people really need to rethink their own systems and do a self-evaluation in order to really do that. And that's the problem. It's not being done. They want to be happy with each other, and they want to go to big conferences and not having fighting with each other. So they concede and they concede and they concede. Everyone's point of view has some sort of reasoning, and the thing that's affected and loses integrity over this is astrology. You don't need to start wars, but my point of view, and I'm speaking with Elena, for Elena as well, because it has been something that we've discussed among ourselves. Well, our main interest is astrology. I really don't care about people's opinions or ideas or fantasies that they might have. Astrology is the thing that needs to be defended, and it needs to be maintained with integrity. And conceding to every lunatic idea that exists is not doing astrology any favors. It's destroying it. A lot of uninformed voices do not do a favor to any kind of system, as we see in the world today. And astrology suffers from that a lot. It has suffered throughout the ages, and it was another of the points that made it fall completely out of disbelief in the 17th century. Was also, everyone had an opinion, everyone wrote a book, and everyone did interpretations. And at the point, people who really knew things said, "Well, I'm not going to dive into this. I'm not going to deal with these people with their lunatic ideas, and they are completely ignorant of the subject." And and this is not being elitist, or I'm counteracting critics that may come up. It's not being elitist because you can study anything. You can just go study and apply yourself to any discipline, astrology, or whatever you want. And you can become a true knowledgeable person and a true knowledgeable practitioner or knower of a subject. What you cannot do is convince yourself that just by knowing a little bit, you are a master of art and that your opinions are worth anything. Unfortunately, they're not. And
yeah,
that's the problem. It's a bit heavy now, but but that's a problem. And people sometimes opening up for every idea go down that slippery slope of anything goes. And astrology is the one that suffers in the middle of all this. Sometimes people discuss the possible backlash that astrology might have from the scientific community, from this conservative scientific movement that underlying is very tangible at this period. And they might be right, because if we're going to concede any person with any far-fetched idea to represent astrology, we're going to get in a lot of trouble. And that's history again repeating itself. It's already happened in the past. And let's hope it doesn't happen now. But unfortunately, we are not a cohesive community, even within tradition. And now I'm restricting myself to tradition again, because that's what we're talking about. And that is not helping. We're not creating a unified corpus that we can all learn from, even if you use more this technique or more that. It's kind of like a recipe. You can put more oregano, or you can put basil, or whatever. It's your own variation within the recipe, but still it is the same soup, let's say. And that's not what's happening. You're doing completely different dishes and incompatible, and then fighting that yours is better than the other, and quoting things endlessly without any practical experience on the subject.
Luís, what I think is really important from this discussion is that people, within the context of the tools and techniques that they seek to use in their astrology, that they become very aware and very conscious of how they're using them, and that they also draw their conclusions from their practical experience. So not necessarily that because I read it in a book, it stands to be true, but have you read it in your life? Have you read it in the lives of others? And have other people also found this interpretation of their lives to be truthful and to hold meaning based on these interpretations that you're giving? And I think that if we root our astrology into what is tangible, what is concrete, and what is practical, then our methods of astrology become better methods, because if something is truthful, it's going to be quite evident that it's truthful, especially after you apply it time and time and time again. But if something has no internal truth, and if something is not standing up to the pressure of actual inspection and objective analysis, then that's something that we should consider pushing to the side and exchanging for things that are known and things that we can see stand the test of time. So I think if we apply this to all of our astrology, and whether or not people are using Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto, because let's face it, they're here, people are using them, it's become a part of the movement that is astrology. I think if we all move into our practice with this specific goal of saying, does it work? Is it working? And am I seeing it working in my practice? Am I seeing it working in my results? Is it bringing me something that is tangible and something that can stand up under scrutiny? Does this thing work? Then I think that becomes the measuring stick for whether or not something should be a part of our astrology or not. And it requires time, and it requires research, and it requires a lot of effort and practice on our parts. But I think that is what we're calling all astrologers to be: practitioners of a tangible and of a concrete astrology, because that's what's going to help to take astrology forward.
And you also need peer reviewing. Peer
Yes.
reviewing. You can have a good idea, but we're always biased to our own interpretation. So you need peer review. You need someone else to go there and say, okay, but couldn't this also be this kind of configuration and this kind of configuration? And for this to exist and for this to develop properly, you would need to have a more, well, I wouldn't like to say the word academic, but it's a learned attitude. There's a scholarity to this that must be done, because or else it's complicated and it's messy and it's the anything goes thing that we cannot allow it to happen. Because then we stop practicing astrology and anything can be astrology, and that's not it. And we all know people who really practice and study and teach us also that this is not the thing to be. And it's quite complicated. And things have rules. Rules can be challenged, rules can be revised. They should, but things have rules. It's like interpreting configurations ahead of time, for example. Interpreting the effects of eclipses months before the eclipses occurred, and this is already the eclipse. No, it's not. The eclipse is going to add to something that's happening. It's not the eclipse. It doesn't work like that. Or else, again, anything goes. But things have rules. That doesn't mean there's room for maneuver and room for analysis and different methodologies. There's always that. But you still need ground rules, and you don't. Tradition has. And if you're really into tradition, that's your staff of power is the rules, the core rules. And then once you have them, as you said before, once you have them, you can flow around and find the exceptions and have movement to have your own methodology and to see other things which go beyond the rules, which in fact they don't, but it's just not so strict. And there's a lot of astrology without rules and with rules that don't make sense. And what I'm saying is people need to be very honest with themselves and with their knowledge of astrology in order to be good practitioners.
Yeah.
And we're always wrong. We're going to make mistakes. We're going to take things for granted. We're going to make interpretations. We're going to get carried away and interpret some wonderful thing that's going to fall on our heads. But that's a process. That's part of the learning process. But still, you have to be aware this exists. You cannot have the arrogance of thinking that, I know it. I control this. I understand. It doesn't work like that.
I also think that in that same vein, we are, at the end of the day, talking about a constantly expanding cosmos. And so while at the same time, we know exactly where we are within the context of our traditional approach, because that's something that we've both invested so much of our time into and so much of our lives into studying and knowing where our astrology is rooted, we also have to take into consideration that we still don't even have a lot of things figured out, and the universe it's teaching us every single day about things, and we're learning every single day. So while we charge forward as dedicated practitioners of our field, we still allow some space within our lives for wonder, and we still allow some space within our lives for the magic that this cosmos still has something within it that we haven't even fathomed yet.
Every chart is a wonder in itself. Every interpretation you do is a wonder, amazing. Things express in ways that you were completely unaware and conceived. You were following the lines, the guidelines of interpretation, and then things manifest in a way that you were not expecting. And that's magical and it's wonderful. None of this takes out the wonder of astrology. And we're still finding things. We're still perfecting our technique. We're perfecting our interpretation, and there's always room for growth. And as any body of knowledge, astrology grows. And I completely support that, and I think that it's true. But still needs to grow properly.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. I mean, everything needs a framework at the end of the day. Everything needs to have some sense of reference to the container that it's in. You know,
Mhm.
because if there is no container, then what we end up with is a dilution of everything. So we always have to be able to bring things back within the boundaries of specificity so that we can grow in the specific manner and we don't just end up, falling flat. And I think that that's the main piece that you're getting to, that we have to have an awareness of where it is we've come from and use that as a vehicle in order to take us where it is we're going.
Mhm. Mhm. Yes, it's in a sense it's respecting things for what they are,
Yeah,
in all sense of the word. I
yeah,
mean, it's not easy to do.
yeah,
It needs a a good frame
yeah,
of mind,
it
and
does.
I think that one thing that we can counteract, and I usually say this to students, to novelty,
Hmm.
because we are in a world plagued with novelty, and we're always looking for the new technique that's going to solve our inability to deal with certain configurations. And I think instead of novelty, we should focus on expertise. We should, as students, eternal students of
Yes,
astrology, focus on being the best interpreters we can be,
yes,
to be the to have that expertise, and that I think it's the core of a good practitioner of astrology. It is
yes,
that the development of that expertise that then can support novelty, discussion, debate, differences,
yes,
experimentation. But that expertise is absolutely essential. And as we said before, on this conversation, it takes time, it takes study, it takes years, and then your years practicing something, and then at a certain point you reach a conclusion, wait a minute, this is not exactly like this, I have to shift the way I'm doing it. And then you have to review your own way of thinking and
yeah,
grow with it, and it's not easy, and it's sometimes you have to break your own beliefs and your own systems in order to evolve and to go further, but it's still within that expertise and that nucleus of knowledge,
hmm,
of marvelous knowledge that astrology is.
yeah.
And I think that's the best advice can be given to a student and someone who's striving to become a good expert of astrology.
To develop that expertise and allow that expertise
Yes.
to pave the way for us. I think that's
Yeah.
absolutely brilliant. Thank you so much for sharing that, Luis, and thank you also for taking this time out. I know we have such a massive time zone difference between the two of us, but
Oh, it's
we
fine.
but we stuck in there. And Luis, as a final piece, and I know that this should have been the first piece, but as a final piece, please tell us where we can get in contact with you, because I know that you also run a school of astrology that is online. Where can we get in contact with you in order to find out more about your work, more about your books? We haven't even spoken about your books a lot today. Luis, everyone, is an author, an incredible author, and both he and his wife, they authored the book On the Heavenly Spheres. So where can we find out more about your work?
Well, you can find it at our website. Our English website was frozen for a long time, but it is academyofastrology.eu. You'll find our courses, books, all the information you need. That's our international site. We also have a Portuguese site, Academia de Astrologia .com, here in Portuguese for Portuguese language, where you find our teachings in Portuguese. And there you can find about our books, our courses, our learning, teaching, everything that we have to offer. I can take the opportunity to say that we had a journal long time ago in 2009, 2010, which was the Tradition Journal, which intended to be a journal on Western as traditional astrology, that then didn't went far from 4 numbers. And we also had something called the Traditional Library with a lot of works and translations, especially from the period of William Lilly and his contemporaries, which will be available online soon. I just have to find more hours in the day than the 24 hours we have to do that. But all that material will be available online soon. You can find about that on our site, on our newsletter. That will be announced there as soon as it's done.
Great.
And other novelties that come up.
Great. So I'm going to put all of that information in the description box down below so that all of you who want to keep following Luís and the work that both he and his wife Elena are doing in not just for Portugal, but also for the larger astrological community, I'll have that information down below. So, Luís, once again, thank you so much from the bottom of my heart for coming and sharing your time, your knowledge, and your expertise here with us today. It was truly a meeting of minds, and I feel as if we have a kindred spirit because there is so much of how we teach and our approach to astrology that parallels each other. So I just want to thank you for holding that space in the world and for also continuing to charge forward for expertise and excellence within the craft and field of astrology.
Thank you. Thank you for the invitation. It was a wonderful experience. So I think we had wonderful conversation.
Yes.
Loved it. I hope this is of value to all the people out there that are looking for astrology and meaning. And
I'm most definitely sure that it will be, because I've been seeing some of the luminaries of our field resharing these podcasts. The other day I saw Dr. Benjamin Dykes resharing a podcast, and I saw Honor Dosher sharing a podcast that I did with Sharon Knight. So it's getting out there, and so I trust that people are going to resonate with a lot that we said today. And so I just want to thank you for sharing from your heart and from the heart of your practice. So thank you.
Thank you.
And for our listeners and our viewers out there who have stuck with this from the beginning until now, I just want to say from the bottom of my heart, thank you once again for continuing to support the Oraculos True Divination podcast. If you want to continue to be a part of the momentum that we're building here, please do first of all, subscribe to this YouTube channel, as well as share this with your astrological colleagues and share this with your friends who are even marginally involved or interested in astrology, because it's important that the world knows that there are brilliant thinkers within the field of astrology, and I try my hardest to bring you those people. So from the bottom of my heart, thank you for supporting the podcast. Thank you for staying here. Thank you for all of your comments and your feedback. It means the world to me. And please do continue to give your comments and give your feedback and like, subscribe, share, because the world needs more interviews with more brilliant astrologers. So from the bottom of my heart and from my entire family over at the Oraculos School of Astrology, thank you for joining us once again. And until next time, be well, be safe, and talk soon. Bye-bye. Okay.
Okay. Hey, a long time.
Long time. Bravo. Bravo. Yeah. This was incredible. This was incredible.